In the first half of the 20th century, the United States grew to become the most powerful nation in the world. But it wasn't an easy growth. Time and again, we turned aside, tried to isolate ourselves from the rest of the world.
Let's go our own way, our own pleasant way alone. Let's enjoy the good things we have earned, and let's not be too concerned with the world around us and their problems that surround us. Don't make their problems our own. I wish we could go our own way alone.
But the rest of the world could not be shut out, not by high tariffs, not by laws about neutrality. And 23 years after the First World War ended, America found herself in a second and bloody. The country of Germany, defeated and reduced to poverty by the First World War, was taken over by the dictator Adolf Hitler. Mussolini became the dictator of Italy, and in Japan, control was taken over by a group of military leaders. Japan was the first country to break the fragile truce of the early 30s. She began to expand and sent her armies into China. Soon, Mussolini followed suit and directed his Italian armies to invade the weak African kingdom of Ethiopia, a kingdom rich in mineral resources which Mussolini decided he had to have. Here in America, the strong desire for isolation prevented us from giving any effective help to the forces of democracy in either Asia or in Europe.
These are hard times, hard times, my friend. Seems like these hard times won't ever end.
We were still in the midst of our great economic depression and struggling to find that prosperity which always seemed to be just around the corner. Even in the midst of trouble, there was progress. The automobile was changing the face of America. In the worst year of the Depression, in 1933, there had still been 1 million cars produced in the country, and a few years later, this number rose to 4 million cars a year. For many, cars were a source of pleasure. Picnics, vacations. For others, it was a way to get back and forth to work. Made it possible for millions of people to move out of the center of the city, out into the more pleasant surroundings of the suburbs.
A motor and 4 wheels makes a man feel like a king, and the power that he feels is a satisfying thing. There's a problem here that jars, and it isn't simply talk. If they fill the land with cars, will there be any room to walk?
But for others, the cars took them away from disaster. The plight of the farmers had never been solved during the 20s, when most of the nation was prosperous. And when the Depression of the 30s struck, the farmers were already poor. The federal government tried to find some way to help the farmers, but the farmers themselves moved out. In overloaded trucks, carrying what possessions they could, they headed for what they hoped would be greener pastures. While statesmen and economists struggled almost hopelessly with the baffling problems of the Depression, scientists developed the new discoveries of the 20th century with spectacular results. Just before the turn of the century, scientists had discovered X-rays and radioactivity, and then finally, the electron. Madame Curie discovered radium in 1898. And 3 years later, the theoretical description of the fission of an atomic nucleus was worked out to describe that discovery. No one could anticipate then the destructive consequences which this discovery was to have.
Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. With this formula, the atom's secret was bared. For mankind, 'twas a fateful hour when the atom revealed its secret power. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. The world could never be the same. Would it bless, destroy, or maim? Soon enough, the answer came. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared.
In the early part of the 20th century, Einstein and the Danish physicist Niels Bohr said we'd have to throw out our old concepts of science and discover some new laws. Then in 1927, the new laws were worked out. They're called quantum mechanics, the mathematical rules telling how atoms and molecules work. Now scientists had both a theory and experiments to develop atomic and nuclear physics. In chemistry, too, there were some startling advances. Linus Pauling had worked out the nature of chemical forces, and soon there were so many new chemical products that people began calling the times the age of chemistry. There were new plastics and new materials like rayon and nylon. But one of the most important effects was to come from a little-known accidental discovery by a Scottish scientist, Alexander Fleming. In 1928, Fleming had been studying the deadly bacteria called Staphylococcus when he left a culture plate open a little too long and a mold formed on the surface. Fleming noticed that in the area surrounding the mold, the Staphylococci bacteria had disappeared. In 1929, he published a medical paper proving that a lowly mold from the soil was a powerful bacteria killer. Fleming had discovered penicillin. But there was no scientific answer for the conflicts that were steadily worsening in Asia and in Europe. In 1937, Japan's merciless air raids against the defenseless Chinese city of Canton shocked Americans and began to turn the tide of feeling in the United States against our traditional position of neutrality. By 1938, President Roosevelt was asking Congress for much more money to be spent for weapons. And in that same year, Adolf Hitler moved his German armies into Austria and united it with the German dictatorship. Next, he threatened Czechoslovakia and demanded that a large portion of that country be turned over to him because he claimed that people of German descent lived there. Now nothing seemed to be able to stop the march toward war. In the late summer of 1939, the blow fell. First, the dictatorships of Russia and Germany signed a treaty, amazing the whole world, since up until that moment they had been shouting insults at each other. And then, a week later, Hitler attacked Poland from one side and Russia attacked from the other. In a short time, they had conquered that country and divided it between them. Then Hitler turned west and south, while Russia proceeded to fight off a piece of her other neighbor, Finland. Soon German troops had conquered the two Scandinavian countries of Denmark and Norway, and then they turned with renewed force on France. The invasion across Holland began in the spring of 1940. Hitler announced that the fight which began that day would decide the destiny of the German people for 1,000 years. Hitler won his first victories with lightning speed. On May 10th, he invaded Holland, and on May 15th, Holland surrendered. On May 28th, the Belgians surrendered. The armies of France were retreating in wild flight. had sent soldiers into France were trying to take off as many of their soldiers as they could from the French beaches at Dunkirk. Within a few weeks, the dictator who had sworn to destroy all democracies stood completely triumphant on the continent of Europe. The American sentiment for neutrality was swept away, and we were ready to listen when England, sorely pressed by Hitler's Air Force, the Luftwaffe, asked for all the help we could give.
It is the purpose of the nation to build now, with all possible speed, every machine and arsenal and factory that we need to manufacture our defense material. We have the men, the skill, the wealth, and above all, the will. We must be the great arsenal of democracy.
We sent weapons and guarded the ships that carried them, for German submarines seemed everywhere. Though we were still technically neutral, the President was calling on our Navy to shoot the rattlesnakes of the Atlantic without waiting for them to attack.
We're supposed to be neutral in this man's war, but we favor Britain defending its shore. We'll never give up in spite of the slaughter till the last Nazi sub is blown out of the water.
England had now gained a measure of defense and a breathing space. But actually, the war was just beginning. And in 1941, two new blows fell. Hitler, who just 2 years before had signed a treaty with Stalin, the dictator of Russia, now attacked Russia. And the Empire of Japan determined to take advantage of the crisis in Europe, and 2 months later tried to secure control over all of the Pacific. She attacked the British outposts of Hong Kong and Singapore, and on December 7th, 1941, bombed the American Navy at its port in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. America was in the war.
The Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor was a disaster for the United States. 5 American battleships were sunk and 3 others heavily damaged. 3 destroyers, a mine layer, and a floating dry dock went down, while other vessels were very hard hit. The United States had suffered the greatest naval defeat in all of its history.
The bombs came down like a deadly rain that black Sunday at Pearl Harbor. Sad was the fate of the ships that were lost. Sadder still the human cost at Pearl Harbor.
Now there was no more neutrality for America. And within a few months, 26 nations were allied against the Axis. That was the name that Germany, Japan, and Italy had given themselves. Slowly, these allies began to fight back from the black edge of disaster where they had been pushed so rapidly by the powerful Japanese and German armies.
England had stoutly held out in Africa, even though German and Italian forces had attacked steadily toward the Nile River and toward the all-important Suez Canal. Now an Allied force landed in North Africa to tie up the German army there and at last force its surrender. After that, Allied troops moved northward into Sicily and Italy and steadily pressed the Germans and Italians into retreat. On Hitler's Eastern Front, the conquest of Russia was nowhere near as simple as he guessed it would be when it began. The Soviets held fast at Leningrad and Stalingrad, valiantly defending their homeland in long and bloody battles, until finally the German attack was broken, and they were forced into slow retreat. In the Pacific, Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur led the American counterattack. It began with a naval victory in the Coral Sea, and here it was the airplane that dominated the fighting. 1943, American troops captured the Gilbert and Marshall Islands and the large island of New Guinea. And finally, the Philippine Islands were invaded. While Americans were moving up the islands of the Pacific, other Americans with their British allies landed on the French beaches and began a new attack on Hitler's European forces. After a series of bloody battles, the Allies gained a foothold and slowly began to advance across France. At the same time, Russian armies were pushing the Germans farther and farther back out of Russia, across Poland, toward the German homeland. Finally, Allied armies fought their way into Germany itself. Hitler committed suicide, and the war in Europe ended. It was the spring of 1945, and a few weeks before, President Roosevelt had died. One of his last official acts was to send out invitations to all of the Allied powers who were fighting the Axis to meet together in San Francisco and formally set up a charter for the United Nations. Though Roosevelt was gone, the meeting took place as scheduled, and the United Nations was formally born.
The United Nations, the United Nations. At the UN you will find the hopes for peace of all mankind. The United Nations, the United Nations.
Still, the war in the Pacific continued, and now American flying fortresses were showering bombs on the cities of Japan. It was clear to all that Japan could not hold out much longer, and yet the Japanese leaders vowed to fight to the last ditch on their home islands. America prepared itself for what might well be the worst battle of the war, the invasion of Japan. But it was never to come. For on August 6, 1945, a single B-29 winged its way above the city of Hiroshima, Japan, and just after 12 noon, it dropped a small bomb which exploded over the city. Observers in the plane, smitten by a flash of blinding intensity, reported that they saw a giant pillar of purple fire, 10,000 feet high, shooting skyward with enormous speed. It had barely reached its zenith when there came shooting out of the top a giant mushroom cloud that increased the height of the pillar to a total of 45,000 feet. Below this gigantic geyser of flame and smoke and dust, which soon reached up 60,000 feet into the stratosphere, Hiroshima lay shattered, with nearly a third of its population of 340,000 people dead or wounded. A few days later, a second bomb was dropped over the city of Nagasaki, and Japan surrendered. The atomic bomb began a new age for America and for mankind. Standing at that dividing line in 1945, Americans could look back on a record of mingled success and failure in the theater of world affairs. 30 years before, Woodrow Wilson had inspired the countries of Europe to create a League of Nations. But then his own country refused to join. There was little to be proud of in our stubborn isolation of the 20s and 30s. But we could take pride in our idealism in the Washington Naval Disarmament Conference, the Kellogg-Briand Peace Pact,
our good neighbor policy with the other countries of the Western Hemisphere, and finally, the United Nations. Our inventors and scientists and engineers had given to the world a new era of transportation and communication, chemistry and medicine, and finally opened up the age of the atom. The bad parts of our record had been sponged away in the blood and tears of the Second World War, and now we were ready to enter the age of the atom as willing members of the world society.
Those who came before us worked with willing hands, though they all came to this country from a dozen different lands, to follow a dream to America where freedom was the goal, where a man might own his own soul, where a man might own his own soul. A nation of immigrants, a nation of immigrants, built this land of opportunity. Descendants of immigrants, of hard-working immigrants. Are we a nation of immigrants? Are we